You know, some parts of scripture you read and some parts you have to step inside of. Today we're going to explore a thousand-year-old poem that, it turns out, holds the very language, the very grammar of one of the most important moments in all of history.
Just let those words sink in for a second. They're some of the most haunting words you'll ever hear. And coming from the cross, they sound like the cry of ultimate despair, don't they? But what if there's something else? What if they're actually a key, unlocking a story that had been written centuries earlier?
So that's the big question, right? Why these specific words? Well, to get the answer, we have to understand that Jesus wasn't just speaking from his own pain. He was speaking from the depths of his own Bible. He was quoting a song. So let's do that. Let's journey back. We're going to wind the clock back a full millennium before the cross, all the way to King David. At a moment of just intense personal suffering, David writes down what we now know as Psalm 22. And in doing so, he gives a voice to an anguish that would one day echo from a hill called Calvary. Okay, so first things first, we've got to be really clear about what this psalm is and, maybe more importantly, what it isn't. This is not some neat and tidy prophecy, not a simple prediction. It's not a list of theological bullet points. Psalm 22 is a lament. It's raw, it's honest, it's a cry from the heart. This isn't just writing. This is someone bleeding on the page. Now, we tend to think that crying out to God like this is a sign of weak faith, but in the Bible, it's the exact opposite. See, lament isn't faithlessness. It's what faith sounds like when it's under incredible pressure. It's the sound of someone holding on so tight that they know they can be brutally, painfully honest. And David is living right in the middle of this tension. He's holding two completely opposite realities at the same time. On one hand, he says in verse 3 that he knows God is holy, that he's enthroned. But on the other hand, all he feels is God's silence, his distance. And he refuses to pretend that paradox isn't there. And right there is a huge truth for all of us. The psalm teaches us that God's silence is not proof of his absence. Sometimes faith just means trusting what you know is true, even when you can't feel it to be true.
But then, the psalm takes a turn. David's very personal, poetic language starts to become almost disturbingly specific. It's as if God himself steps into David's real-life suffering and begins to shape his words into a picture of a much greater suffering yet to come. Just listen to this. David describes public mockery. He talks about his bones feeling like they're out of joint. He's surrounded by enemies, and then he says his hands and feet are pierced, and that people are casting lots for his clothes. I mean, this is a blueprint for a crucifixion, 1,000 years before that was even a common form of execution. So how does this work? How do we even understand this? Well, there's a theological idea for this. It's called typology. The idea is that this isn't about David making some wild guess. It's about God telling his story in advance. A real person's real suffering becomes a type, like a pattern or a mold that points forward to his ultimate fulfillment in Jesus. David is a pattern bearer, showing us the shape of what was to come. Okay, so let's go back to the cross. With this 1,000-year-old pattern fresh in our minds, let's listen again as Jesus cries out. You see, he is not admitting defeat. He is not losing his faith. In that Jewish culture, to quote the first line of a psalm was to call the entire psalm to mind. Jesus is claiming this whole story, all of it, the pain, the trust, and the final victory. He is claiming it all as his own. He is pulling the entire emotional and theological weight of Psalm 22 right there onto the cross. He's identifying with the deepest parts of the lament, yes, but he is also staking his claim on the anchor of trust, the absolute certainty of vindication, and that explosion of praise that we're going to see comes at the end. It's like he's looking at his own suffering, looking back at this ancient song and telling all of history, this is that. This thing you've been reading about for 1,000 years, it's happening now. I am the one it was always about. And here's the part that so many of us miss. The psalm doesn't end in suffering, not even close. Right around verse 22, with absolutely no warning, everything shifts. The entire mood flips from agony to pure adoration. Look at verse 22. I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. How do you get from, my God, why have you forsaken me, to that? How is that even possible? Well, here's the key, and it shows you the very logic of the cross. The praise comes before the rescue. David starts to worship not because his problems have magically disappeared, but because he trusts the God who will solve them. This isn't just wishful thinking. This is resurrection logic, centuries before the resurrection ever happened.
And from that single point of trust, the praise just explodes. It's not a personal song anymore. Suddenly, all the nations will worship. Future generations will hear about it. The song expands to fill the whole world and all of time.
And how does it end? The very last Hebrew phrase of Psalm 22 can be translated as, "He has done it," a declaration of a finished work. And what were Jesus' final words from the cross? "It is finished." It's the exact same declaration of victory.
So here's maybe the best way to put it all together. If you want to really understand the cross, you need two key passages from the Old Testament. Isaiah 53 gives you the theological explanation. It tells you what Jesus accomplished. But Psalm 22 gives you the theological experience. It tells you what it actually felt like.
That's why we can say Psalm 22 is the grammar of the cross. It gives us the structure, the vocabulary, the very language we need to understand what was going on. It doesn't just show us the event, it takes us inside the heart of the one experiencing it.
So what? Why does this ancient poem matter to you and me today? What's the takeaway from all this?
Well, it means that our own honest, painful cries to God are welcome. They aren't a sign that we're losing faith. They're an invitation to trust Him more deeply. And it means that when we feel alone, when we feel that silence from God, we know that Jesus has already been there. He has entered into that silence for us and filled it with His presence, which guarantees that even our most desperate cries are now held safely inside of His finished story.